this is John Harcher, and welcome to episode 44 of Valleys of Numenor. Today we'll be looking at all the other worlds created by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Whether it's civilizations on Mars or Venus, an upside-down world at the Earth's core, or his own Lost World adventure, Burroughs did it all. He did so many of them it was hard to get any of them outside of Tarzan onto the big screen, but there were several attempts with various levels of success. We'll go over all of that today. Episode 44, The Worlds of Edgar Rice Burroughs, other than Tarzan. Before we get into all of the things in Edgar Rice Burroughs' literary career beyond a certain King of the Jungle, let's take a look at what brought him to the business in the first place. He was born in Chicago on September 1st, 1875, and came from a long-standing family here in the States. They go all the way back to the Revolutionary War. He wanted to join the military himself and went to a few of the academies, but didn't get into West Point. Then after enlisting, he was diagnosed with a heart problem and was discharged. From there, he was a cowboy, a miner, a railway executive, and finally, a pencil sharpener salesman. Needless to say, it wasn't very fulfilling. In 1911, having run out of things to do, he decided to try his hand at writing. He submitted a story as Normal Bean, which he somehow thought was a clever pun, but ended up being misunderstood as Norman Bean. But no matter who got the credit, Under the Moons of Mars, published in All Story magazine in 1912, was a success. It was soon reprinted in book form under the name A Princess of Mars. So began his first series, The Martian Novels, or the Books of Barsoom, named after the word Martians used to describe their own world. The first novel had Civil War veteran John Carter transported to Mars, where he becomes involved in a war between the Red Men, who are basically human, and the Green Men, who are 9 feet tall and had 4 arms. He also fell in love with the princess of the city-state of Helium, Dejah Thoris. The story ended on a cliffhanger, the first of many. One other innovation Burroughs had is setting himself as not only the narrator, but the nephew of the protagonist, giving him a rooting interest in the story. Before Burroughs returned to Mars, he wrote a second novel about a king with a hidden identity, The Outlaw of Torn. Then he came up with a novel about a guy raised by apes. He returned to Barsoom in 1913 with The Gods of Mars, which returned John Carter to Barsoom, and he, Dejah Thoris, and Tars Tarkas, the Green Man, do battle with the Holy Therns. It also introduced the slave princess Thuvia and Carthoris, the son of John Carter. This one also ended in a cliffhanger, leading to the Warlord of Mars in 1914 that sent our hero to many lands in search of the kidnapped Dejah Thoris. Burroughs started another series and did several one-offs that we'll talk about before returning to the series with Thuvia, Maid of Mars in 1960. This time Carthoris was the hero searching for the kidnapped title character. Sounds familiar. Burroughs then left the series alone until 1922 when he returned with the Chessmen of Mars. He came up with a unique concept. The pieces were life-size and consisted of a body and a head with legs that moved from piece to piece. Think of a slightly less frightening-looking creature than the walking head in The Thing. The other innovation was it involved the daughter of John Carter and Dejah Thoris, Tara, and her paramour Gahan of Gathol. Remember that last name, we'll see it again. The next Martian novel didn't come along for another 5 years. In 1927, the Mastermind of Mars introduced another Earthman who traveled to Mars. This time World War I veteran Ulysses Paxton and his dealings with the title character Ras Thavas. The next book, A Fighting Man of Mars from 1930, really broke the formula in that involved just regular old Martians battling it out. But it did involve Paxton in a way that helped link the other Burroughs novels together. We'll get into that when we reach the next set of books. After 5 years off, Burroughs returned to Barsoom with Swords of Mars. This brought John Carter back into the center of focus and involved the voyage to the 2 moons of Mars. Surprised it took him this long to do it, considering the original title of A Princess of Mars, remember, Under the Moons of Mars, but that's how long it took him. In 1939, he wrote Synthetic Men of Mars, a follow-up to Mastermind of Mars, that kind of took one thread from that story and tried to play it out to full short-length novel. The remaining writing he did about the Red Planet consisted of short stories. 4 of them appeared in 1940 and were later collected under the name Lana of Gathol, named after the granddaughter of John Carter. The last book in the series was John Carter of Mars. It didn't come out in book form until 1963, but the 2 stories in it were published in the 40s. The first, John Carter and the Giant of Mars, turned out to be a Burroughs story, just not quite Edgar Rice. His son John Coleman Burroughs actually wrote it for a picture book. The second story, Skeleton Men of Jupiter, was meant to start a new spin-off series of stories, but that was the only one he wrote about it. Now, going back to the first stories that Burroughs wrote, I would put the first era as 1912 to 1918. He was feeling out where he could write good stories. In 1913, he wrote a story called The Monster Men about a secret island and a doctor running crazy experiments. A little clunky, but distinctively Burroughs. He then wrote a cycle of stories about a brother and sister from Nebraska. The first, The Mad King, was basically ERB's version of The Prisoner of Zenda. The next one, The Eternal Lover, took Barney and his sister Victoria to an estate in Africa owned by none other than Lord Greystoke himself, Tarzan. Victoria then gets knocked out and finds herself in the Stone Age, being romanced by a caveman. The sequel, Sweetheart Primeval, brings her back to discover her dream might have really happened. The final part, Barney Custer of Beatrice, takes him back to the Ruritania stand-in from the Mad King. Then, to confuse things even more, when they were turned into books, they were done separately. The first and fourth stories were published as The Mad King, and the middle 2 as The Eternal Savage. Having so much success with Tarzan, Burroughs looked to play off of it in other stories. In 1917, he came up with 2 that took people from civilization and put them in the wild to survive. The first was The Lad and the Lion, and the second was a pair of stories published as The Cave Girl. He also wrote a futuristic war story originally published as Beyond 30, as in Latitude, and released in book form as The Lost Continent. Confusing if you read it later and expect a tale of Atlantis or something like that. His most unique was a loose trilogy of stories revolving around a character named the Mucker. It was a term from the turn of the century describing a scrappy guy from the gutters, basically. You would have thought they'd come up with a different name for it at some point, but they never did. Over the course of the 3 novels, it included probably every type of story except science fiction. It had action, it had romance, it had intrigue, it had even like business stuff. It was wild stuff. His next series started in this era and began as a 2-part story like some of the others he did around this time. In 1914, he published At the Earth's Core, where inventor Abner Perry and his assistant David Innes take a mechanical drilling mold down into the Earth's crust and end up in a world inside our own called Pellucidar. As expected in a Burroughs story, they find a group of humans living among the dinosaurs still alive there, since time doesn't exactly work the same there. There's also a species of overlords named the Mahars, who enslave the humans, and it's up to David to rescue them and rescue Dion the Beautiful, of course, the girl. The story ends with a cliffhanger, and Burroughs finished it up the next year with Pellucidar. For a decade and a half, it looked like that's where the series would end. And in 1929, Burroughs put out Tanar of Pellucidar. Like the Martian series and the Tarzan series to some extent, he moved the focus away from previous hero David Innes to a younger one, the forenamed Tanar. At the end of the story, David Innes is captured, and Abner Perry tries to send word to the surface asking for help. Surprisingly, he gets it in the form of radio amateur Jason Gridley, who just so happens to be the friend of the literary version of Edgar Rice Burroughs. In his sole explicit crossover, Tarzan at the Earth's Core in 1930, Gridley reaches out to Lord Greystoke since he's going to need money for the rescue mission. His idea is to enter the hollow world of Pellucidar through the opening at the North Pole via a custom-made dirigible named the O-220. Who knows, there actually was an opening to Pellucidar at the North Pole, but it makes for a very thrilling sequence. While there, we get the odd situation where Tarzan is in a jungle where he's not the lord of. At the end of the story, David Innes is rescued somewhere off stage. So much for the meeting of two great heroes. Burroughs left himself a cliffhanger by having one of Tarzan's crew get stranded and Gridley staying behind to find him. But there was also a tie-in to a third series. While Gridley was out, Burroughs is hanging out in his house listening to his radio when he received a message from Ulysses Paxton on Mars. He then told ERB the story depicted in Fighting Man of Mars. The castaway Von Horst received his own story 6 years later, first published as 7 Worlds to Conquer, but released in book form as Back to the Stone Age. At the end, Gridley pops up briefly to let everybody know David Innes went searching for him. David does a lot of off-screen things in these stories. Burroughs looks to fix that with a series of short stories he wrote in 1939, telling the adventures of Innes as he returned home. There was one problem. Nobody wanted to publish them. He was forced to turn them into a novel and published it as such in 1944 as Land of Terror. Burroughs, however, did sell the next set of stories about Pellucidar, and they were published in 1941 and 1942. However, before he could finish the overarching story, World War II broke out. Burroughs was actually living in Hawaii at the time of Pearl Harbor and ended up going into battle as America's oldest war correspondent. By the time he returned to writing and finishing the last part, his usual markets had pretty much dried up and was left unpublished until 1963 when Canaveral Press collected the published stories with the unpublished one and called it Savage Pellucidar. But Pellucidar wasn't the only time ERB had dealt with dinosaurs. Right as he was beginning his writing career, another famous author was moving on to another stage of his own. Sherlock Holmes creator Arthur Conan Doyle had been looking for another character to work with and found it in Professor Challenger. Physically almost Holmes' exact opposite while being equals intellectually, he made his debut in the 1912 novel The Lost World. Professor Challenger and his team discover a South American mesa where dinosaurs somehow still live in the modern era. Burroughs used that as an inspiration and came up with the island of Caprona, or Caspak, the land that time forgot. It was published in 3 parts originally, but all in one as a book. But later in the paperback era, the stories were split apart again into The Land That Time Forgot, The People That Time Forgot, and Out of Time's Abyss. A German U-boat rescues a group of British soldiers and American Bowen Tyler. Then the motley crew discovers the legendary island and its prehistoric inhabitants. But Burroughs doesn't stop there. He devises a whole system of evolution as the explanation of the different tribes of humans on the island. Little rough to read now, knowing his belief in eugenics, but there's none of the bad implications of that in this story. Now, if Mars was a fertile ground for interstellar travel, how about the moon? Burroughs scratched this itch with an interesting mid-20s trilogy loosely known as the Moon Maid saga. The title story was published in 1923. It's sort of similar to H.G. Wells' The Shape of Things to Come, only ERB beat him to the punch by about a decade. An interplanetary rocket, the Barsoom, was supposed to go to Mars but ends up being sabotaged on the moon. There, the crew discovers the enemy Calcars, defeats them with the help of a beautiful loco, it is Burroughs after all, who falls for the hero Julian V, and then they head home to Earth. Happy ending, right? Well, in 1925, we find out things are not at all well. In the sequel, The Moon Men, the bad guy they left behind had gotten the Calcars together, leading them in an invasion of the Earth. Now, the hero of this story is Julian IX, the reincarnation of Julian V once removed. He ends up losing his battle, but his descendant would win the war. In the story, the Red Hawk, Julian XX, shouldn't it have been Julian the 21st? He finally defeats the Calcars, who have been governing suspiciously like the Bolshevik-era Soviet government. The reason is this was originally a story titled Under the Red Star about a battle against Soviet domination many years in the future. Boy, he was really ahead of his time, wasn't he? Somewhere along the way, he changes to the futuristic ending of the Moon Maid saga. It's come to be regarded as one of Burroughs' finest works and was the subject of an iconic Frank Frazetta painting that adorned paperback covers for decades. But Burroughs wasn't done with interstellar travel. In the 1930s, he decided to head the other direction from Mars and started the saga of Carson Napier with Pirates of Venus in 1932. Right at the beginning of their story, he immediately links it to his others by having Jason Gridley fill him in on the missing Von Horst down in Pellucidar. From there, he meets Napier, who's going to take a rocket of his own making to Mars. And you thought Bezos and Musk were trailblazers. But as usual, something goes wrong and the rocket ends up on Venus, or Amtor as the locals call it. From there, he goes through adventures and meets a beautiful local. It is Burroughs, after all. Through this story, Lost on Venus in 1933 and Carson of Venus in 1938. Then, as he was wont to do in the late 30s and early 40s, he wrote a series of interconnected stories that would eventually be published in book form as Escape on Venus in 1946. He wrote one additional story, The Wizard of Venus, around this time, but it didn't see print until Tales of Three Planets in 1963. Then as a standalone book paired up with another unpublished story, Pirate's Blood, which has nothing to do with science fiction. Burroughs was supposedly working on a sequel, but that appears to have been lost. The Amtor series isn't as well regarded as the Tarzan, Martian, and Pellucidar ones. I think even ERB realized his story type had pretty much been beaten into the ground. So much like the Red Hawk, he infused these later stories with a tinge of political commentary that may have either gone over the heads of readers or struck them as strikingly unsubtle. Possibly unsatisfied by the Venus series, he started out on another one about a pilot who ends up on the planet Pellucidar beyond the farthest star. The first story was published in 1941, but the second wasn't picked up until Tales of Three Planets. He had a real rough patch here in 1940, 1942. It seems that for every 2 stories he got published, 1 got rejected and didn't see print till well after his passing. Appropriately enough, he passed away in the town named after his creation, Tarzana, California, in 1950 at the age of 75. Now, being so prolific outside of the Tarzan books, you'd think he'd have been better represented on the big screen, but outside of the Ape Man, it's been hit or miss. Believe it or not, there's only like 8 or 9 of them. Oddly enough, the first film based on his work wasn't Tarzan of the Apes, but The Lad and the Lion from the same year as Tarzan of the Apes, 1918. Unfortunately, it doesn't appear to have survived. This was loosely remade in 1936 as The Lion Man. It was done very cheaply. Then they tried to play off the story of Tarzan and the Lion Man, so Burroughs sued. Now, as I mentioned, The Mucker and The Return of the Mucker would have made a really great film or serial in the early to mid-20s, lots of action, and someone doesn't have to speak in the crazy dialect that Burroughs made for him. You know, like, I'm a rough guy from the thing, so kind of almost like Popeye. That never happened. Now, ERB might have actually had the first full-length animated film based on one of his novels, namely Princess of Mars. In 1936, animator Bob Clampett worked with John Coleman Burroughs for a year to put together a pitch for a series of films based on the novels. Around 90 seconds or so of footage exists. Yeah, that's it. Would have been amazing, but clearly was a lot of work. It might not have beaten Snow White to the screens, but it would have rivaled the Fleischer's Gulliver's Travels. Bob ended up going back to Warner Brothers and doing okay for himself. I'll actually be talking about him a little bit in an upcoming episode of my YouTube series Left Turn at Albuquerque. I think episode 5 will touch on him a little bit. His next non-Tarzan film venture was based on a one-off story from 1932, The Land of Hidden Men. It's basically a late Tarzan novel without Tarzan, same type of plot and situations. Its alternate title was Jungle Girl, and that's what its title was when it reached screen a decade later as a 15-part serial. Or should I say, the title reached the screen a decade later. The plot and the characters were completely unrelated to the actual Burroughs story. They ended up making a sequel, The Perils of Nayuka, but had to remove any references to Burroughs since the only thing they used from the first film was the non-Burroughs character. Guess this happened a lot back then. I mean, just look at the Captain America serial from 1944. He had most of the outfit without the wings on the cowl, but wasn't named Steve Rogers, wasn't a soldier, had no shield, didn't take any super serum, and didn't fight the Red Skull. Why bother with Captain America? So after that, that was it for the Tarzan-less Burroughs on screen until 1974. British film company Amicus, best known as a competitor to Hammer in the horror film game, decided to make a film out of The Land That Time Forgot, directed by Kevin Connor. They didn't have a large budget, so they worked out a distribution deal with American International Pictures. It was right up their alley. Now, rather than going the Ray Harryhausen route used in films like 1 Million Years BC or Valley of Gwangi with stop-motion animation, they decided to just use rubber outfits. But not even the kind they used in Godzilla. They shot a lot of close-ups, so you can't tell how cheap they look. To star in the film as Bowen Tyler, they got Doug McClure. You might remember him from such TV shows as The Virginian and Barbary Coast, movies like SST Death Flight and Warlord of Atlantis, being the father-in-law to Jonathan Cain from Journey, and best friends with Burt Reynolds. McClure's casting was the one stipulation AIP had to provide funding for the film. The movie basically stuck to the plot of the first part of the novel, or the first novel in the trilogy, however you want to look at it. They only used the Caprona name for the island, never mentioning Castback. Now, much to both companies' surprise, the film did pretty well on both sides of the Atlantic, considering it was a lower-budgeted release. It even ended up on network television on NBC a few times as part of their movie package. This success inspired them to make another Burroughs-related film. This time they tackle At the Earth's Core. Connor would again direct. They brought back McClure as David Innes and got Peter Cushing to play Abner Perry and genre favorite Caroline Munro as Dia. For some reason they dropped the N. It's just as easy to say Dion, but whatever. It was around the same budget as the earlier film, though I have to say Iron Mole was depicted pretty faithfully. Once they got to Pellucidar, however, the budget restraints showed. When they had the Mahars swoop down from their perches, it looked like they just dropped them on strings. The film did okay, but not as well as The Land That Time Forgot. I actually didn't even know it existed until the mid-'80s when it showed up on WABC's Saturday night 11:45 p.m. movie. Cushing and Monroe had better luck the following year, with the actors playing a bad Bond girl in The Spy Who Loved Me and Peter doing a quick one-off space opera type film. But it did well enough to merit another film. They thought about trying to do John Carter Mars. McClure and Monroe as John Carter and Deja Thoris. The picture just makes itself right there. But not surprisingly, they couldn't afford the rights. Instead, they'd go back to The Land That Time Forgot for The People That Time Forgot in 1977. It was time for a rescue mission for Bowen Tyler, and his friend Ben, in the book he was named Tom, would take a big plane to fly over the cliffs and search for him there. It actually bears some similarities to how Tarzan and the gang went to Pellucidar in Tarzan at the Earth's Core. As Ben, they hired Patrick Wayne. He had a busy year in fantasy films. He also played Sinbad in Harryhausen's Sinbad and the Eye of the Tiger. Veteran character actor Shane Rimmer played the pilot. He was actually also in The Spy Who Loved Me that year. And as a new character, a love interest for Ben, they hired Sarah Douglas. I'm not 100% sure of the timing on filming. It was released in late August that year, so I doubt it was in production over the summer. But since AIP, the company that made films in 10 days because they had leftover sets, was involved, I can't rule it out. I bring it up because Douglas's hairdo was a little odd. She took her long hair and made two little buns out of them on either side of her head. Looked like another character who had her hair up in buns on either side of her head. Right after this, Douglas went on to a set in London and cut her hair off short and worked with Marlon Brando, so I'd say she did okay for herself. To fill in for a character type like Caroline Munro, literally, they hired pop star Dana Gillespie as the only actual character from the book, Ajor, and gave her about the same amount of clothing as Caroline Munro had. The film overall was less successful. I was watching it recently, and during the scene early on where the pterodactyl attacks the plane, my son walked in, took one look, said, "Oh my God," and walked out. I said, "Hey, this is all we had." After that, ERB has only been on screens 2 other times without a Jungle Lord, and they were both the same story. As mentioned earlier, people had tried to get an adaptation of John Carter of Mars going since the Clampett film in the 30s and the Amicus flirtation in the 70s. The main stumbling block, of course, would be the depiction of all the stranger creatures on Barsoom. Animation would make sense, but it would have been a lot of work. Then in the 90s, there were a lot of rumors of people wanting to take a shot at it. The first one I remember was Die Hard director John McTiernan looking to do it with Tom Cruise as John Carter and Julia Roberts as Deja Thoris. By the turn of the century, both Robert Rodriguez and Kevin Conrad had their names attached to it, but it never got anywhere. Then in 2009, Asylum Films finally gave us Princess of Mars premiering on the Sci-Fi Channel. Antonio Sabato Jr. played John Carter, and Tracy Lords was Deja Thoris. They had the Green Men there as well, but the filmmakers took some liberties with the story. Carter was a soldier in Afghanistan when he somehow ends up on Mars. There's another soldier who ends up on Mars with them, and let's face it, Asylum had less money to use than Amicus, so it looked about as advanced as an elementary school play. The same year, Asylum also did a remake of The Land Time Forgot, using the word remake loosely. But the big news was Princess of Mars would be getting a big screen adaptation from Disney made by Andrew Stanton, director of the Pixar films Finding Nemo and WALL-E. With a big cast and successful director at the head, looks like things were going to be great. They got a solid cast in supporting roles including Bryan Cranston, Ciarán Hinds, James Purefoy, Thomas Hayden Church, and Willem Dafoe as Tars Tarkas. For the lead roles, they picked Taylor Kitsch as John Carter and Lynn Collins as Deja Thoris. Kitsch was best known for his role on the show Friday Night Lights, and Collins was on True Blood for a season. The two had one more connection. They appeared separately in the film X-Men Origins Wolverine. That one wasn't looked upon highly, to put it mildly, so when the two were cast in this film, the internet jokes started up. But Stanton was a lifelong fan and diligently went to work on his dream picture. Then it became the worst thing that can happen at a studio, the pet project of the previous management. There was a change of department heads at Disney, a very acrimonious one. The film started going over budget, and quietly the decision was made to let the film hang out to dry. Well, maybe not so quietly, as word began to leak out it was in trouble. The last straw came when it was time to promote the film during the 2012 Super Bowl, a prime target for any movie that wants to build up buzz before release. The team prepared a 60-second commercial that would show off the film in the best light. The advertising team purchased a 30-second floater, meaning the commercial would show up somewhere eventually. And instead of using a shorter version of the 60, they went with an odd montage of different images from the film, giving audiences no sense of what it was actually about. The commercial showed up somewhere in the middle of the fourth quarter. So the film opened in that bustling film season, mid-March, and did okay. Overall, it made around $300 million worldwide. Not a bad haul. But when your film cost $250 million, fair to say, you haven't made your money back. The film was barely in and out of theaters when Disney took a $200 million tax write-down in losses, a practice we've seen a lot more in recent times with films getting completely pulled and shut in the vault. It still stands high on the list of films that lost the most money. But you want to know something? It's my favorite film of this century so far. I mean, I love the Lord of the Rings films, but Burroughs was my first favorite author. I remember when I was getting into reading them, I picked up books 2 or 3 at a time. I kept thinking of how they could do this on screen, trying to figure out a rational explanation for John Carter's transportation to Mars. I think the film does this brilliantly with the idea of the medallion tying in the Therns from Gods of Mars and the whole idea of the tomb that only opens from the inside, plus having Burroughs as his nephew like the book. It streamlined things a bit by having Todos Mors as Deja's father instead of grandfather, and it gets rid of the whole atmosphere factory idea. There were complaints of opening the film with a blast of exposition. Stanton tried including it later in the film, but it really would have stopped the narrative flow. He approached it as someone who expected everyone else to know who John Carter was and did the story that way, and realized John Carter's not as well known as he thought and had to explain things quickly. Whatever the film's flaws were, I saw John Carter discover himself on Mars and how he could jump really far. The incubators of the green men, Thoats, white apes, red men, okay, done with tattoos, and of course Woola the dog? Disney lost such a great marketing opportunity having little stuffed Woolas in all their stores. This film was as close to how I pictured Barsoom in my mind as I was going to get. Add in Michael Giacchino's amazing score. It stands with the best of John Williams and Howard Shore. And the ending works out just right. It left the door open for a series of adventures, but considering what happened, it also doubles as a perfect closure as well. I've seen this movie 20 times over the past decade. I just love it. As far as the future goes, not sure what will happen. Supposedly Warner's put in an option for the Martian novels, but who knows where that stands considering what they've been going through with their properties. For now, we'll just have to wait and see. As we finish up here, I mentioned Burroughs liked to insert himself into his stories. For many, he'd write an introduction and explain how he came to tell the story he's about to relate. For some reason, he didn't include one with Warlord of Mars or Thuvia, Maid of Mars. The Warlord, I can understand, it was in the middle of the story and would have been a hard fit. Thuvia, however, is perfect for an introduction. So I decided to help ERB out over 70 years after he died, and came up with this intro for it myself. In the cache of papers John Carter left with me were many more stories beyond the tale of his return to Barsoom, his reunion with his beloved Dejah Thoris, and his earning the title Jeddak of Jeddak's Warlord of Mars. Someday I hope to be able to tell the tale of his journey to the far side of Mars with Cantos Can and Tars Tarkas and their adventures there. Of most interest to me was the story of his son Carthoris and Thuvia, Princess of Tarth. It seems to me that the result of the union of two such remarkable sires would be an astonishing individual in his own right. Such is the case with the young Prince of Helium. And what of Thuvia, second in beauty only to Dejah Thoris herself? The girl had earned the eternal love and loyalty of the entire royal family of Helium, with her actions defending the princess and aiding the Earthman in her rescue. It also led to the rescue of her father, Thuvendin Jeddak of Tarth, who had set out in search for his lost daughter. The new alliances that were forged among the different tribes and races on Mars were a benefit to all Barsoomians. But would they also lead to heartbreak for one young prince? I hope you find this story as exciting and enthralling as I did. Hey, Mr. Burroughs, it was the least I could do. Next time, it'll be Conan of the comics. We'll go over the Barbarian's history in the medium from Marvel to Dark Horse, back to Marvel, and his new home over at Titan, plus a few extras as well. Please hit the subscribe button if you like what you're hearing. I'm John Hartroff. Thanks for listening.